The financial order aims to facilitate international trade and investment, promote monetary stability, and avoid major crises. The non-proliferation order attempts to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. And finally, the human rights order seeks to preserve the basic rights and liberties of individuals everywhere. Far from being obsolete, these core pillars of the international order are essential. They enhance the security, prosperity, and freedom of Americans. U.S. policy should aim to preserve them at their core, even as specific rules and institutions change and adapt. That objective yields two tasks. First, to reform the pillars, rules, and institutions to better support U.S. interests and values. Second, to create incentives for pivotal countries to embrace the pillars. While recognizing the interplay between the two, this report focuses largely on the latter. This effort is vital in today's world where China seeks regional dominance and global influence, and Russia is aggressively revisionist in Europe. Both are working with Iran and North Korea in an axis of upheaval to challenge a world dominated by the West. The current U.S. administration has even pursued its own form of upheaval by altering multiple key policies and relationships. In this new environment, the U.S. should recalibrate its foreign policy and prioritize the swing states because their decisions about the international order and to what extent they work with Washington's competitors will have an outsized impact on the United States. Each of the swing states is multi-aligned and maintains ties with the United States, Russia, and China. They don't want to be forced to choose between the great powers, and they all seek meaningful changes in international rules and institutions. Each state also plays a dominant role in its region, and their actions have global repercussions. The U.S. should encourage these pivotal states to pursue policies that reflect the core principles of the liberal order, and work with them to deny advantages to the Axis states. Our report lays out a path for how to do so. The recommendations we offer are far from comprehensive, but propose a few starting points for U.S. policymakers and partners in the swing states, such as establishing minilateral groupings in key areas, developing critical minerals partnerships, empowering Congress, and immersing American officials in the politics and economies of each swing state. Doing so would involve some significant changes to Washington's current foreign policy trajectory. Those changes are also a must if we wish to see a world that favors U.S. interests and values. Before I hand it over to our panel to dive deeper into the report, a few reminders for the Q&A portion of the event. Viewers online can participate by entering questions into the chat box at cnas.org/live or on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2025. After the panel, our moderator, Kathy, will be able to address questions from both our in-person and virtual audience. Kathy, I'll hand it off to you now to get the discussion started.
Hello. Hi. This is great. Thank you, Gibbs, for that introduction. Thank you, Gibbs and Richard, for hosting this, and everybody for coming and for your interest. Gibbs already did a wonderful job. Well, first I'll introduce the panel. So Richard Fontaine, CEO of CNAS, everybody knows. Ambassador Mark Green, former president of the Wilson Center and USAID administrator during the first Trump administration, and Matan Chorev, associate director at RAND Global and Emerging Risks. Gibbs already did a good job defining the terms of this report: global swing states, international order. I always like to start with terms, so I wanted to hand a little more detail over to Richard, specifically about that term swing. So Gibbs has described what a global swing state is. What are they swinging from or to? And since you first started writing about this a decade ago, you've added two more to the list. How did they get there?
Well, thanks for everybody for being here. And the term swing states, when we first came up with it in our first iteration of this project more than a decade ago was taken quite obviously from this notion of domestic politics, where you have swing states and elections that could go one way or the other, or sometimes vote one way and sometimes vote another way, and therefore are the focus of campaigns. They get the most attention, they get the most resources, they get the most visits because they have a disproportionate payoff for the expenditure of time, attention, and resources. And so we looked around the world and we said, okay, if you have the U.S. and its allies and close partners, and you now have kind of an axis of upheaval of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. You might throw in some others there like Venezuela and Cuba and some others. You have also some pivotal states that are multi-aligned that have relationships simultaneously with the U.S., with China, with Russia, that are making their own decisions, but don't fall completely and squarely into sort of one side or the other. Which are the most important of those, and therefore which are most deserving of American foreign policy time, attention, and resources? Those are the swing states. As you said, in our first version of this, it was 4 countries, not 6. We since added Saudi Arabia and South Africa. I think Saudi Arabia is probably the easier to explain. I mean, under Mohammed bin Salman, it is taking on a much more significant regional and international role. And is both in its economic security and diplomatic choices, making decisions and taking actions with sort of global resonance. South Africa, frankly, there was a case for South Africa the first time around, but I think there's more of a case today than there was back then. Again, if you look at South Africa as a global actor, not only has it been pushing for a seat on the UN Security Council, but South Africa led the African peace mission both to Ukraine and Russia. It very controversially has taken Israel to the International Criminal Court of Justice and is a member of the G20 and hosting it this year and things like that. So I think the case for South Africa is stronger today than it was before. So that's how we got to 6.
And on the government side of dealing with this, I understand from a source familiar with the matter that you worked on this over at Policy Planning. And I'm interested in how you conceptualize this set of challenges from the government side and tailoring a strategic approach to a post-Cold War system that's a bit more complicated than they're with us or against us. As you referred to it, I think monogamous was the term you used.
Well, thanks. No, I'm happy to be here. I'm a huge admirer of the endeavor of the authors and of the report, and I'm really privileged to share a panel with all of you. 2 very brief comments to answer your question. One, on how and why this became such an acute diplomatic preoccupation for us, and then what we learned about how to navigate it. And I think, on the one hand, as Richard's earlier report makes clear, this is a secular trend. If you guys read national security strategies like I like to do, I know it's not a most cool people have better hobbies. The 2010 Obama national security strategy talked about emerging centers of influence and listed a number of the countries in the report and noted their growing weight and the growing importance for American diplomacy to figure out ways to deepen partnerships so that we can enroll them in shared challenges and shaping order. But a couple of things happened in the intervening years that made this a more acute issue. And I would say you could list a number of them, but I said from the perspective of serving in the last administration, I think what I would describe as a somewhat phlegmatic reaction of much of the world to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and to Beijing's not so subtle reaction to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, I think really shook our confidence and crystallized the challenge of navigating what is increasingly a hedging world. And it's not just as the Obama administration national security strategy conceived of it as countries with increasing weight whose partnership matters more, but countries that are increasingly capable and determined to be their own poles in an increasingly multipolar system. Countries that saw an absolute imperative to diversify their diplomatic relations and policy bets because they had now felt, for many reasons and in many acute ways, the risk of strategic dependencies, and were absolutely determined to reduce those moving into the future, and they were determined not to become the grass on which great power elephants trampled. So in some cases, it's a return to the natural order of international politics. Secretary Rubio recently said that America's kind of unipolar moment was indeed an anomaly, and he's right. But the kind of new, old normal was deeply unfamiliar to America's diplomats. And I would say to some members of Congress who were indeed unfamiliar with this more polyamorous diplomatic world. So what do you do about it, right? It's one thing to define the challenge, but we're not allowed to admire it in policy planning. So I think what we tried to do, and I would not claim success, and I would say, my big takeaway is I think we're going to continue to be deviled by it, is to try to put this in a bigger construct. One, obviously, exactly as the report suggests, you have to deal with these countries and the broader global south on its own terms, on the issues that matter most to them. And we had a series of summits from the Pacific Islands to the African Leaders Summit to the Summit of the Americas to ASEAN, where it was just about a shared agenda on its own terms, and you have to deliver on that agenda. The second, again, as the report makes clear, these countries are not stakeholders in the status quo. They have a view that you need to reform the international system. And so you have to demonstrate a seriousness of purpose in doing that, both in the architecture itself, making it more inclusive, giving them a seat at the table and more weight in decision making, but also making sure the international system is fit for purpose to address the issues that matter most to the developing world. But rather than panic about, we're losing the global south, we're not popular, you really have to, as the report very helpfully does, focus on the countries that matter most, whose decisions will matter most, and where we have the biggest set of interests. And I think there, what we tried to do is not delude ourselves that we can get them on our side generally as a kind of geopolitical camp, but focus on the distinct areas where it was really critical for us to maximize the odds of strategic alignment and minimize the risk, or at least slow the pace of strategic divergence. And that had to do with military and intelligence partnerships. It had to do with critical supply chains, economic dependencies, and of course, the technology stack, the digital infrastructure, and increasingly the importance of AI to that. And I would say, while we made progress in the conception, we have a lot of room for progress on the execution. I would highlight a couple of lessons. We could do that in the panel, or I can offer that now, whatever would be most useful.
Panelists, what do you think?
Yeah.
Let's bring it. Well, I was thinking when you mentioned the learning curve for members of Congress and diplomats, who do I know who was a member of Congress and also a diplomat who might be like from a swing state? And then I thought, oh my God.
And I was going to say, I'm going to take Richard's analogy and beat it to death here when it comes to swing states. So I am from Wisconsin. It is the classic swing state. Let me tell you a little bit about swing states. By election day, we hate it. Right? You've seen 1,000 ads per day. It drives you absolutely crazy, and you tune everyone out. Guess what? That's what this is like. So we were talking about it before. So I was not only a member of Congress, but I was an assistant whip. The most useful training ground I ever had when it came to politics, but also diplomacy, because it forced you to understand each of your whip charges, their district, better than they did. So you knew what you could ask and what you couldn't ask. And when you were looking for a vote and they said, I'm sorry, I can't do that, you could either say, BS, you can, or I got you. If we're going to look at these swing states and a larger set potentially of swing states in play, we should not categorize them so easily. I'm not sure they want to be called swing states. I think what they're more interested in is going country by country, sitting down. You begin the conversation by saying, what do you got? What are you facing? South Africa is the classic case. So when you look at South Africa, we think South Africa, oh yeah, critical minerals. Worried about China. So we begin the conversation, we say, we really don't want you to be with China. And they said, okay, you're here for China, you're not here for us. So you begin the conversations by listening, by understanding the country. In the case of South Africa, they've got significant economic challenges, employment challenges. They're looking for ways to create sustainable, lasting jobs. So when we talk to them about critical minerals, we're thinking about, can we have your minerals? They're thinking about, okay, how do we turn these minerals into jobs for our young people? Big difference. They're facing significant crime challenges. Homicide rate is skyrocketing. We need to be able to talk to them about different ways in which we can be helpful. The bad news is it's not easy. It's not happening next week. It's going to require careful investments. The good news is we can do this. And so I think as we think about each of these countries, you're exactly right. We should think about each of them on their own terms. Shouldn't call them the Global South. Guess what? China's not in the Global South. Russia, we talk about the BRICS in the Global South. Guess what? Russia isn't in the Global South. Don't use those terms. Go country by country. Understand what they can do, what they can't do, in ways in which we can be helpful. Historically, we're actually pretty good at that, but it requires a patience. It requires an engagement. When you build coalitions of the willing, which is what this country's security has been built upon, they're more powerful than simply those that are forced on countries through threats, which what the other side does. So good news is we can do this. It's not bad news. Sobering news is it's going to take a lot of work.
To continue to beat the swing state analogy to death, one of my favorite quotes covering the midterms came from Wisconsin, in which I said, "What's it like being at the center of all this action?" And he said, "It feels like we're being punished for something," which I think actually gets to a relevant point, which is how do you ensure that engagement with these swing states on their own terms is actual investment, actually useful for these states, and isn't just a propaganda exercise, which I think brings me to the next question, which is what do we mean? What are we trying to do? What does success look like? Wisconsin is going to go red or blue or red or blue.
Or green and gold.
Or green and gold. This report seems to suggest that we're not actually. We're not, the expectation is not that they're actually going to be in one camp or the other, that they're going to remain multi-aligned. So what does success look like in that world? I'll start with Richard.
Yeah, so kind of have a category conceptually where success generally looks like providing incentives and paths for these countries to ultimately be closer on the same side in seeing the kind of world we want to see. So we define these specific 5 pillars that Gibbs talked about of global order. Countries have positions on all of these. They're all important in each of these countries. But where do they come down on this? And this is going to be a continually kind of evolving thing. And then also denying advantages to our adversaries. So we care about these countries not only because of Russia and China, but in part because of Russia and China. And we don't want to see, for example, Chinese bases and Chinese technology in some of these countries. But then the other thing is, our interests in these countries stem from our interests in the competition with Russia and China, but those are not our only interests. This is kind of what Mark, I think, was getting at. It's in part a matter of tone and focus in the diplomacy, but it's also about seeing these countries as the countries in their own right. We have interests in our relationships with these countries that goes beyond just, pieces on a chessboard that we're trying to move around.
And how do you convince them of that in practice? If the conversation that we're having is swing states in the context of great power competition, it seems difficult, like conceptually it seems difficult not to lead with great power competition in terms of dealing with these other countries. But you have ideas about this from the government side, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice and one we tried to heed, however unevenly. I mean, I think ultimately it comes down, like any partnership, whether they see aligning and deepening partnerships with you is advancing what they want for their own people. And our capacity to do that benefits the partnership, benefits our geopolitical aims if it means that critical countries are less dependent on or vulnerable to coercion by adversaries. And it obviously serves the aims of the country in question. So if we are seen as a force for advancement and achievement of national imperatives, I think that is part of the success. And I think in some areas, as the report suggests, your definition of success needs to be more modest because you're not going to get them to vote with you on every vote at the UN. And if that's going to be the measure of whether or not you're going to deepen that partnership, you'll be profoundly disappointed. And I think one of the things that is hardest for American statecraft is to prioritize and compartmentalize. We do still like to demand fidelity on all the things that we care about. And I think we've learned over time the limits of that, and that we have to accept that we're going to have need some resilience in these partnerships because we don't see eye to eye in everything. But that disagreement should not prevent us from moving forward in areas that are in mutual interest, whether it's supporting a country's energy transition or whether it's finding opportunities to create markets for their critical minerals, or whether it's opportunity to have our technology companies be present and competitive in countries whose market size and regional weight and global voice will determine which of the tech ecosystems ultimately predominate. So I think that's one thing. But ultimately, our biggest headwinds, more than our attitude and rhetoric and bad habits that the ambassador talked about, I think is the strength of our offer. Our ability to leverage our tools of economic statecraft to actually deliver, facilitate investment really, I think, held us back. And I think, obviously there's none of this was fit for purpose, and there was a lot of energy, appropriate energy that needs to be spent on reforming and modernizing those tools. But it's not going to help if we pull back, whether it's on foreign assistance or pull back from international financial institutions and the like. So that's at least a couple.
Yes, I wanted you to weigh in on the role of development assistance and soft
Sure.
power, and again, in the context of great power competition and China's, strides in this field.
Well, again, it goes back to this notion of going to countries where they are. So every now and then, in the last administration, for example, and in other administrations, because of the time I've spent in Africa, if it's Tony Blinken or whoever is going to Africa, the media would always call me and they'd always say, what do you think about this? And I'd say, well, the first thing is I look forward to a day in which trips to Africa are so frequent, it's no longer news. That's what we want to get. And I don't care, Republican or Democrat, right? It's something we have to get to. For nearly 35 years consecutively, the foreign minister of China has made his first trip of the year overseas to Africa. Think about that. And us, we'll get to it at some point. Maybe in the first year, we'll see. We need to spend a lot of time, I think, doing that. We do have to understand that we're not going to agree on everything. That shouldn't be a surprise. We should be clear on those things that do matter to us. What are the strike issues? Because they exist and they're important. And the best way you communicate those is face-to-face, behind closed doors, and say, look, this is what matters to us. And good diplomats are doing that all the time as we speak. That's what diplomacy is. And the diplomatic community needs to get together if we're dealing with, whether it be Turkey or say, South Africa, our key allies. The diplomats meet all the time, and they exchange information, and they talk about things that we see, and we look for ways to incentivize and to nudge and to push things forward. So again, it's methodical. It's not happening next week. It takes time. But one thing I want to amplify, because we don't do it enough. What is our greatest strength? It is the model. So when I was at AID, what I used to say is, people would say, how are you going to beat China? I always hated that question, but how are you going to beat China? I said, look, I'm just going to be very clear about what it is that we offer and what it is that they offer. And when you go to the Americas or Africa, for example, we would say to every country in the world, look, we want you to go from being aid recipients to partners to, in a perfect world, fellow donors. We want you to be self-reliant. If an investment from Beijing makes you more self-reliant, someone in Beijing is going to lose his job, because it's the opposite in the Chinese model. They seek dependency. They want you to be more dependent. That model for countries that have aspiring young entrepreneurs that are looking to take their seat at the table, the strength of that model should win almost every single time. But we need to be clear about what it is that we want to see. What does success look like?
Can I just add one thing to this? So I think that's totally right. but we also have the strength of our market, the attractiveness of our market, which of course I think we're going backwards now on this. So we have, you know, the most open, the biggest market in the world, and every country wants access to it. We also have our values. It was interesting, especially in Indonesia, to hear folks say, look, you know, if the United States stops talking about and seeming to stand for democracy and human rights and liberal values, then it's just a power contest. It's who makes the best offer between you and China, or who has the greatest strength, or who has the most money. You have to stand for something different in the world, something that's attractive. And you know, that of course is, you're not going to hear that from all of these countries, but again, this is part of the model that I think Ambassador Green is talking about. What is our sort of offering? It's the model of engagement, it's the market, it's the values and the way we talk about the values. It's what we ultimately stand for, which can be good for these countries, not just for ourselves.
And this is something that Gibbs alluded to as well. But so if the value proposition that the United States is offering is a little different now than even a few months ago. You know, 50% tariffs threatened on Brazil. I don't want to dwell too much on this aspect of it, but the idea of, you allude to the idea in the report of America itself being a global swing state. What, I guess, is that, how do the folks on the panel see that affecting the long-term prospects for the U.S. not to necessarily get all these states to swing our way, but to manage this global environment? I guess I'll start with Dem.
Okay. I mean, look, I think if you look at it from the perspective of our engagement with these countries, on the one hand, a more transactional approach has a lot of benefit, right? You can cut a deal, you can focus on specific areas, you're not going to condition your investment or your partnership, say, on things like human rights as much as you would have in the past. And so that maybe provides more of a trade space. On the other hand, both the point the ambassador made about, well, what is the content of that partnership, but also ultimately, if part of the calculus is about delivering for their domestic imperatives and their own economic trajectory, well, then now the balance sheet, the cost versus the benefit of aligning with us, of taking a risk, or of has become just more expensive. So even if you've made the strategic decision that your country's future depends on enhancing your strategic autonomy, reducing your strategic dependencies, ultimately you have to factor at what cost. And if through a combination of tariffs or you know, coercion, then you're going to assess the cost differently. Your ability to actually execute that strategic pivot and be responsive to your political dynamics become a lot more difficult. So I do worry that even if there are examples, and we're going to begin to see them, of specific transactions that seem to both benefit our interests and the partners, it will erode the longer-term foundation for the kind of sustainable partnership you need in what is likely to be a, you know, multi-decade period where geopolitical competition is more acute.
I don't think we know entirely. Early days still. So President Trump is clearly right. These countries want access to U.S. markets and access to U.S. investment. He's absolutely right. How that materializes and operationalizes is a work in progress. I think we'll know more in coming months. I remain hopeful. I think we have to be hopeful. But I think it's still unknown. There are tariff deals and there are trade deals, right? You can set tariffs, but the question is, what does the trade relationship look like? And that's what the administration is working on. And I think that's going to be really the best way for us all to evaluate the progress that is made. If the administration is using discussions on tariffs as a precursor to building a lasting trade and investment relationship, those discussions, then that presents the path forward. We talk here about how we work to incentivize development and growth. Clearly, we're going down a new pathway and a new model. We know that innovative financing, private investment done right, can accelerate development. We know that private enterprise is still the greatest force on the face of the earth for lifting lives and building communities. As we work on this, if we do this right, it can accelerate outcomes. Now, there are lots of hiccups along the way. There are other factors that we don't even get into. You have 130 million displaced people around the world in those movements. We're seeing challenges over natural resources that are oversubscribed. A lot of those things are significant challenges, and I think how those get addressed in this context are also going to be key.
So just a note on this business about the United States being the global swing state. So, we made research trips to these countries, and to get to Mark's earlier point, some of the governments and policy thinkers in some of the countries seem to like this term of global swing states. It sort of shows their standing in the world, and finally someone gets us. There's other places, especially in like Ankara, for example, said we don't swing in any direction.
We're not
we know
polyamorous.
exactly where we're going. This suggests some sort of uncertainty about the path ahead. We use this again as a way to identify priorities in U.S. foreign policy, as opposed to some group of countries that, because they're global swing states, work together or something like that. That said, in a lot of places, we also heard, we're the global swing states? What the hell do you think the United States is, especially given this kind of, at best, skeptical attitude of the current administration toward these 5 pillars plus more of the global order? I mean, does the United States want an order, a territorial order like has been traditional, or do we now think spheres of influence might not be such a bad thing? The trade order, I mean, you can sort of write that yourself. All of that said, I think it still is early days, and I also think that there's some kind of basic structural truths about these things. I mean, these features of international order really have benefited Americans in a lot of ways, and they will. There's some things that have happened, the evisceration of our soft power tools, the AID and MCC and international broadcasting and IRI and NDI and NED and all the rest of it. I really suspect that at some point, probably in the next year or two, the administration, everyone else in Washington will wake up and say, we want actually soft power tools of foreign policy. We don't want to just do diplomacy and issue statements, and we don't want to go to war. We still have big military. So what's in the middle? Well, all of the stuff that we used to have but don't have as much of anymore. And by the way, what are Russia and China using to try to achieve the same ends with these and other countries, but from another perspective, exactly as the kind of soft power tools that we'll end up having to rebuild? So I think there's some kind of baseline truth, and certainly it's a volatile period in U.S. foreign policy, but I would still put the U.S. as a different kind of swing state, at least, than the one we're talking about.
I mean, who wouldn't want to be in the same category as Wisconsin, though? That's my question. What are these Turks talking about? I'm going to go to some good questions from the virtual audience here, because it gets to something that we're sort of hinting at. It's been mentioned that some elements of the international order should be reformed to better support U.S. interests. And, if the global order that you identify now is sort of in flux or swingy, it's interesting you issue this report at the same time the foreign affairs out on your coffee table thing says, like, why do we even need alliances? That's the fashion of the moment. But it does seem people can find consensus on that something needs to be reformed. What elements in any of your views bear the most need for reform, and how can the U.S. take steps to do so? This is from Ellen.
I'll take a first crack at this, and I suspect that Matan has thought a lot about this. As Gibbs said in the opening, there's sort of 2 aspects to the question that we had on the table when we did this project. One is, how does the international global architecture, the set of institutions and representation, need to be changed or reformed in order to achieve some of the objectives that we set out here? And the other is, how do we deal with individual states in order to achieve those objectives? This report's about the latter, but of course there's an interplay between the two, because some of the things that these countries and others want is greater representation in the international arena. I think there's some obvious things, but in some ways the obvious things are the hardest things of all, right? I mean, the most obvious thing is the UN Security Council does not reflect the power balance in the world today. And maybe it reflected the power balance in 1945, but even that's kind of arguable, right? But it certainly doesn't today. okay, well, what do you do about that? Well, you reform it. You have more permanent seats and all this other kind of stuff. Well, that actually, as it turns out, is really, really, really hard to do, and may not be done. And of course, then you've got the paralysis of the Security Council itself because of the rivalries within it. So that would be an answer, but it seems to me, if not one that's going to have any sort of resolution near term. One of the things that is more interesting, and which you're seeing lots more of, is essentially alternatives to the traditional and especially the universal representation bodies in all of these kind of mini-lateral groupings, many of which are increasingly focused on a subset of, a relatively small subset of countries for some reason, or a set of issues where you pull together the countries that are most important on those issues, and then they have kind of representation and some decision-making power there. And that, to me, is sort of the future of multilateralism, as opposed to sort of shaking one's fist at, what are the exact IMF voting shares and whether the World Bank president gets to be an American or somebody else, or the makeup of the UN Security Council. Although I see the frustration on some of these countries. So I think it's in the minilateral kind of groupings, and there's a huge horizon for creativity, including from the US in that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would say three things. One is posture, one is structure, and one is policy. As a matter of posture, the United States has to kind of embrace the shift to multilateralism, not be seen to resist it. I think it's also important for us to give voice to the fact that, yeah, the international order is inadequate for a lot of the countries, and that we're not a status quo protecting things as they are, but we have an affirmative and practical vision of reform that we're prepared to work with these countries on. And in a way, again, this is harder to do today than it was a few months ago, but draw the kind of distinction that the ambassador mentioned between a kind of affirmative reformist vision versus a more revisionist approach to the kind of fundamentals. And I think the dilemma for diplomacy is that everyone agrees you want a reform of the international system, but nobody agrees on how. The second has to do with structure. I agree, yes, the universal organizations really do matter, especially to smaller countries. They see a lot of faith in that. They really rue the fact that the UN and other organizations are falling victim to growing strategic competition in terms of their ability to deliver on, public goods. But even in the more mini-lateralist or fit-for-purpose coalitions, I think we have to be more intentional about broadening those and making those as inclusive as possible. I think, for all the talk about, a community of democracies coming together, I think we have to be, again, a little bit more big-tented in our approach. And then lastly, and I think in some ways most importantly, are the policy priorities that we are using these mini-lateralists or the international organization towards actually the ones that the developing world cares most about? And I think there is, again, making sure that we're actually prioritizing development finance, infrastructure, technology, climate adaptation, future of energy, really matters as well.
A few thoughts. Excuse me. First off, I don't think we should talk about reforming the system, because that implies it's a project, we'll get this done, okay, we're okay now. Sorry. This is a pathway that is going to be with us as far out into the future as I can see. It's going to be evolving, not a sort of a one-off reform project. I think, secondly, what am I hopeful about? When you look at some of the innovative financing tools that are out there, harnessing the might of private enterprise, the possibilities are unlimited. And just because we've stopped doing programs that we used to do doesn't mean that we should walk away. It means we need to find new ways of accelerating opportunities, because it's good for the entire world, including for ourselves. And again, I go back to it. I think it's really important that we understand what the future of these relationships, multilaterals, will be. So my friend Baroness Catherine Ashton, former EU foreign minister, talks in terms of tankers and yachts. And she said tankers are the old relationships that have been there for decades. We count on them. They cover a whole wide range of issues. They really irritate us because they're slow. They can't maneuver very well. And then there are the yachts. And we love yachts because they can move quickly. Can't carry a lot of people, but they can move really fast and they're maneuverable. We need both. We need to jump on taking these yachts for specific purposes. And it's not so much mini-laterals, because that implies we'll take the same broad range of issues, but just with a smaller number of countries. Good luck with that. Those will be really small mini-laterals. Instead, they're more like AUKUS, right? They're more like the Quad. They're more like these. They have a more limited purpose, but for that purpose in those countries, they're really important and can be really effective. We need both. If we get rid of the tankers, we'll end up having to do them again anyway at some point in the future. They still matter. Can't cover the things we want, and they drive us crazy, but you really do need both.
And I will say, before I kick it over to questions from the audience, and think of some questions so, you know, the online folks don't eat your lunch, because I got a whole list here. Credit where it's due to Richard and Gibbs for not defining the international order in institutional terms, like the UN Security Council or the IMF or the WTO or whatever. It really is just a set of principles within which I think there's a lot of flexibility to define different kinds of institutions, multilateral, minilateral, multilateral, a la carte, et cetera. Are there any questions from the audience, or should I go to the iPad? Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, hi. Michael McKinley, former State Department. And hi to everybody on the stage. And also, thank you very much for your very considered remarks and issuing this important report. I just wanted to suggest, in the context of the issues you've raised, because so much of it is seen through the prism of the United States' strategic adversaries, or where we can develop some kind of connectivity to emerging states, swing states, middle powers, whatever term one chooses to use. But there's another dynamic at work, which is that different regions of the world, all of the countries you've identified, it's not a question of defining relations to the United States. They're pursuing their own trade relations, new groupings within their regions. They're building political and security ties with countries that really have nothing to do with us, have nothing to do with China. Southeast Asia, redefining its security priorities and relationships with the Gulf. The Gulf is on an incredible trajectory of transformation that reaches out to every part of the world. Even in South America, we see important countries beginning to develop an approach which is much more global in nature. And so how would you see the United States, not just looking at what, it's not just simply, if I'm trying to suggest, a question of the needs of these countries or finding common ground, it's responding to what's a profoundly changing environment. And somebody on the stage mentioned transactional. It's a more transactional environment for everybody, not just for the United States. How would you propose responding to the dynamic that is one of much wider global engagement by the actors you've identified? Thank you.
Who wants it?
I would just say, it's good to see you, Ambassador. I would just say, principally, it's actually could be seen as a huge diplomatic opportunity for the United States, because these relationships, if they're healthier, if they're more robust, can be force multiplying. You know, the fact that the Gulf can be engaged on, you know, or Turkey, for example, is eager to be more engaged in Africa, can be a partner, has various assets to bring to the table, whether it's, you know, the unique strength in construction, right, where we're trying to do these big infrastructure projects. Or, you know, the Indonesians, as they said to me, don't call us a fence sitter, we're bridge builders. Use us to deepen and strengthen and improve your ties in a region where you've maybe been a little bit too absent. Lean on us to help you understand the dynamics in ASEAN and how to navigate that. So, you know, we talk about this as a challenge, but I also think it can be an enormous opportunity for creative about navigating what is a very different landscape.
One of the recommendations in the report that I think is really important, and it's really long-term, and that is we need to educate a new generation of Americans to understand not just these global swing states, but understand a new set of diplomatic skills, right? We need new tools, we need skills, we need to understand The reason for optimism, we are a creative people in a creative country. There is no reason that this can't be a great new opportunity for all of us. It does require freeing ourselves from shackles and bureaucracy. We're going to have to move much faster than ever before. And it's not going to be one-offs. It is going to be steps. It's going to be a project or a transaction with an eye towards something. It's a whole new world that I think can be really exciting, but it's going to require all of us to really invest in a new generation, young diplomats coming up. The opportunities are great, but it is going to be chaotic. It's going to be a little bit noisy, but I, for one, think it can be an exciting time.
Sir. Both. Yes, Ann.
Tony Carroll. This certainly lends me to think that our statecraft has to be much more nimble than it's been in the past. And we need, talent and tools in which to be able to exercise this and to operate in this new reality. At the same time, we've seen a decimation, if you would, of our tools in the last few months to be able to engage in this new this new world. And I'm wondering, how we can get the attention of the powers that be across the street to say that, the sort of decimation of our tools of foreign policy and diplomacy are in effect inuring to the benefit of those countries in which we're competing in this new environment. And I just, for an example, as we go down this path of tariff-led foreign policy, we see that being used to our disadvantage by China in the context of Africa, at least. When we've raised these tariffs, China has all of a sudden made a unilateral offer to allow all African exports duty-free into Africa. So it seems like to me like they're playing chess and we're playing checkers in many instances. And it seems to me that without more tools, as Ambassador Green suggests, and a new sort of orientation of people coming into the world of diplomacy, we're right now playing catch-up, and I think we're falling further behind. It's more of a comment than necessarily a question.
Well, I'll tack on the question, which is, what do you think of that?
Well, first off, Tony, how about if we move the Foreign Service to the University of Wisconsin? We're both Badgers. So.
Larry Eagleburger would like that.
Yes, indeed. I think the most important thing that we can see in coming weeks and months from the administration is a definition of success. I think countries all around the world are looking to the U.S. and saying, okay, we're still trying to understand, what is it that you want to see? I think defining success, however they wanted to define it in the national security strategy, national economic strategy, I think is crucial. So that there's an understanding of the tools that we have, the tools that we need to get, and how they're going to be deployed. But that statement, that definition of success, that vision for success is crucial because everyone in the world wants to know where the U.S. is going and how can they be part of that. So it is providing that clarity, I think, that is crucial. Again, it's early days in the administration. I'm very hopeful that as the administration, the State Department moves forward, they'll continue to work and create that vision. I think it's an important opportunity.
I would just say everyone should be interested in reform of these soft power tools and institutions and improvement of them. But if you eviscerate them, then I think we're all going to get mugged by reality here before too long. I mean, there's some very specific examples already of some of this. So, there was this huge earthquake in Thailand and Burma, and the Chinese immediately rushed in all kinds of assistance and search and rescue teams and food and all these other kinds of things. Why? Because they think they have an interest in doing that, because they, it's one of the many opportunities potentially to do good, but also to project some influence. And so this is the kind of thing the United States would normally have also rushed into for the very same reasons, except they didn't really rush much into it because the people who would have rushed in were on administrative leave and, and all of this. And then you look around and you say, well, okay, if we want to provide assistance in the face of some sort of humanitarian disaster, where are we going to get it? Well, let's call Indo-PACOM. Well, they can move stuff. They could help with people. They don't have bags of rice. They don't have blankets. They don't have these sorts of things. We had a whole agency that had things like that, right? That's just one example, but as these start to pile up, I think, again, I said this earlier, but I think at some point we're going to get, and it's probably in the next year or two at the outer bound, where we say, oh wait, there's a reason why we had all these things. And we had them because it was in our interest to do some of this. So if in the course of trying to improve it, we got rid of it all, then we're going to have to reconjure some of these tools and institutions.
I think we have time for one more, maybe possibly two. And this gentleman here, I promised. Okay.
Hi, thanks everyone so much. My name is Nick Ackert. I'm the Deputy Director of Research at the Asia Group. One thing that really resonated with me for this discussion and the report itself was how much agency we attribute to our swing state partners and understanding that they are constantly hedging and navigating to find the deal that aligns best for them. And I think one challenge about hedging is, especially for those unique issue areas where those countries are inevitably caught between great powers, and these are things like territorial integrity or freedom of navigation, and there really is no place to hide on that. The strategy for many of these countries is taking equal and opposite reactions in both directions to really ensure that they can keep the largest number of doors open and maintain positive relations with all of their friends. And so one thing I'd like to hear more about is how we should think about that give and take and that compromise, and what policymakers should do if we acknowledge that alignment with the swing state in one of the 5 pillars of order might mean that that state drifts a little bit further away. And so how should we prioritize that lineup? Thanks very much.
That's a big one. Is there another one in the room, or should I? Oh, yes, ma'am. So we'll take these both, and then we'll consolidate into a mega answer.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Hendrickson-White. I'm an adjunct senior fellow here at Center for New American Security. Good to see you, Matan. As you know, I've spent most of my career in the federal service, either doing oversight of the State Department or serving in the State Department. And I will just say, with respect to the last question, although I'm personally really sad to see so much evisceration, to use Richard's words, of our apparatus, I will say there is a certain opportunity that I see coming, and the most exciting questions for me are the ones about how not to reconstitute exactly what we had before, but how to think very critically about how we do it differently and better. So when CNAS does that project, Richard, I want to be a part of that for sure. My question has to do with where multilateralism fits into this, and I know you specifically didn't take an institutional approach in this report, but a couple of your pillars have to do with things like the WTO and the UN and the IMF. And obviously China has taken an approach where providing bilateral assistance gives them a lot of soft power advantage. The US many years ago did a version of the BRI and called it the Bretton Woods institutions. And yet we don't necessarily get a lot of political credit for our significant investments in those institutions. Where does U.S. engagement in these institutions fit, in your mind, sort of moving forward, and what role do they play specifically in shaping the way swing states see America?
Okay, so question about prioritization of pillars, am I right? And also about multilateralism, and you can take whichever one you want.
So multilaterals, and you mentioned the UN and such. I mean, they're having the same discussions that we are. In other words, they're going through reform and evolving, and they need to. They need to make sure that their tools are fit for purpose. And I think for the U.S., engaging in those efforts and helping to say, look, this is what we hope to see, participating in that conversation, I think, is terrifically important. There is a temptation when we face questions about multilaterals to say, okay, well, let's just create new ones. No, let's not actually do that. We got a lot of them. It's figuring out ways to reshape those institutions, and I think that needs to take place. With respect to priorities, One of the things that we did in my days in the first Trump administration is we created country-by-country roadmaps. And they had outcome-based metrics that suggested, actually, it's not so much what we wanted to see as what experience told us was necessary for countries to advance and grow and embrace opportunity. I think go back to that. Again, you're not going to be perfect in everything, but at least it presents this vision for what it is that we hope to see, going with humility. So look, we haven't gotten it right all the time, but this is what we've learned along the way. And guess what? You can learn from mistakes that we've made. I think when you lay that out, I think not everything is going to line up perfectly, but I think you can advance things. And then again, I think with the multilaterals, I think engaging in those conversations of reform and evolution are key.
Yeah, I would just say on the priorities, you're totally right. I mean, the prioritization with each of the countries of what they matter most on and what we think we can achieve. And I think we have to distinguish between priorities and preferences. So, a couple of examples. I mean, we have some lessons learned from the Huawei 5G experience, right? We wanted no country in the world to allow Huawei to build out the 5G network. But as it turns out, if Huawei builds a 5G network in a close ally of the United States, it actually matters more to us than if it builds out Papua New Guinea's, right? So it matters. It matters with the countries. If South Africa has a position in opposition to a dollar-dominated international financial system, that is less consequential than if Saudi Arabia decides that that's the path it would like to go down. South Africa matters more on some other issues, right? So that's the thing, is sort of matching what's achievable to what's important and distinguishing, and those are the priorities. Everything else is preferences, which would be nice, but we could probably
goes
live
back to the assistant whip
Yeah.
analogy, right? Is understanding what it is that they can do and what they can't do and what you really care about.
I would just close with two comments. One, I very much hope that this is not a moment of restoration but reinvention of our foreign policy toolkit, and I think that's ought to be the imperative moving forward. I also think we have to remind ourselves, the question was asked, how to make the case and by what metrics to judge the strength of our diplomacy, and I think we just have to go back to first principle, that the power and purpose of American diplomacy is to safeguard and accelerate our own domestic renewal. And to the degree that our disciplined engagement abroad, whether it's in the multilateral organizations, it's with these countries, playing the long game, being present, connecting our needs to their needs, and finding practical ways to cooperate, if you can demonstrate that result, that success over time, I think that goes a long way. And I very much hope that we'll return to that.
That was great. Thanks, guys. Thanks everyone for being here. Go.